Before you read another word, picture this. A village. Quiet. Ordinary. Children running through unpaved streets. Smoke curling from chimneys. Neighbors calling each other by name. A community that had existed for generations. Rooted. Alive. Real. Then, in a matter of days, it was gone. Not abandoned. Not relocated. Erased. The homes were buried. The families vanished. The names were stripped from every official record. And the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something far more terrifying. The silence of power covering its tracks. History has a habit of remembering the victors, the powerful, the ones who controlled the pen and the press and the pulpit. But what happens to the stories that were never meant to survive? What happens to the people who were deemed inconvenient? You are about to enter one of those forbidden chapters, a story so deeply buried that most people living near its very ground have never heard a whisper of it. A community that was sacrificed, not by war, not by plague, but by greed, wearing the mask of progress. What was done here was unimaginable, and what makes it truly terrifying is that it was done deliberately. The question is not what happened. The question is, who decided that no one would ever know? To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. This was not a remote outpost or a forgotten settlement. This was a thriving community, one with churches, schools, market days, and centuries of memory woven into its very soil. Families here traced their roots back through generations. The land was not just land. It was identity. It was legacy. But someone else had decided that this land was worth more than the people on it. The forces that set events in motion did not arrive with weapons drawn. They arrived with paperwork, with promises, with the polished language of inevitability, the kind of language that makes ordinary people feel that resistance is futile, that the decision has already been made, that their only dignified option is to comply. Behind the scenes, deals had been struck. Agreements signed behind closed doors by men who would never set foot in this village. The resources buried beneath this earth, whether mineral, industrial, or political, had made it a target. And targets, in the calculus of power, are never treated as people. What the community did not know was that the plan had been in place for years before a single word was spoken to them. The destruction of this place was not a reaction. It was a scheduled event, and that revelation changes everything. When the orders finally came, they came fast. There was no negotiation. There was no appeal. Residents who had owned their land through documented deed, through inheritance, through blood and sweat and sacrifice, were handed notices that their homes would be cleared. The timeline was not generous. In some cases, families were given days. In others, hours. The machinery of erasure moved with terrifying efficiency. Structures that had stood for over a century were demolished before their inhabitants had fully vacated. Personal belongings left behind were not catalogued or returned. They were destroyed. Documents, photographs, family records, the very evidence that these people had existed here, were lost, discarded, or actively suppressed. And here is the moment that redefines everything you have read so far. Official records from this period show almost no trace of the displaced community at all. Not because the displacement didn't happen, but because someone made sure it wouldn't be found. Cross-referencing surviving witness testimonies, collected decades later by independent researchers, reveals a pattern that historians have called administrative erasure. This was not bureaucratic negligence. This was a deliberate process of making a community disappear, not just from the land, but from the historical record itself. Families were scattered across distant regions. Those who tried to return were turned away. Those who tried to speak found no platforms willing to amplify their voices. The powerful had not merely taken their homes, they had taken their story. And for decades, it worked. The silence held for years. For some families, it held for generations. But silence, no matter how enforced, is never truly permanent. The truth has a way of surfacing. In the journals of forgotten academics, in the oral histories passed down in hushed tones, in the stubborn refusal of survivors to let their experience die with them. When the first serious investigations began, and they came slowly, painfully slowly, what researchers uncovered was not merely a local tragedy. It was a template. The methods used to clear, erase, and silence this community had been applied elsewhere. The same language, the same bureaucratic mechanisms, the same calculated suppression of records. Some of those responsible faced eventual scrutiny. In rare cases, limited accountability. But the architecture of justice in such situations is almost always deeply flawed, delayed so long that consequences become symbolic rather than real. The men who made the decisions had often died in comfort. The institutions that enabled them remained intact. What makes this story matter today, urgently, directly, now, is that the mechanisms of erasure have not disappeared. They have evolved. Communities are still displaced by forces that brand destruction as development. Records are still shaped by those with the power to shape them, and the voices that most need to be heard are still the ones least likely to be amplified. This is not ancient history wearing a costume of relevance. This is the operating manual of power, and it is still being used. There is something deeply human about the desire to build a home, to plant yourself somewhere, to become part of a place, to believe that what you have built cannot simply be taken. And there is something deeply dark about the systems that have always existed to exploit that belief. What this story teaches us is not simply that terrible things happen. We already know that. What it teaches us is that the most dangerous erasures are the ones that happen quietly, without war cries or visible violence, but through paperwork and silence and the slow suffocation of memory. The forgotten deserve to be remembered, not because remembering fixes anything, but because forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting is a choice, and it is always made by those who benefit from the silence. You have now heard a story that was buried, that was suppressed, that survived only because someone refused to let it disappear entirely. What you do with that knowledge is your own reckoning. If this darkness moved you, if it made you feel something that demands an outlet, leave your thoughts below. This history belongs to all of us now. And if you believe that buried stories deserve to breathe, subscribe, because there are more of them than you know.